And with more on the drumbeat for war with Iran, we're joined by veteran intelligence analyst Ray McGovern, who, of course, served in the U.S. Army before joining the CIA. He was the chief morning briefer of Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, and he, of course, famously has confronted Rumsfeld and others about their lies about WMDs. I remember, I guess it was 5 years ago now, time flies, he pointed out that if he was Dick Cheney, he would stage some crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, like the Gulf of Tonkin. And then Seymour Hersh of New Yorker magazine came out about 2 years later, after Bush had left office 3 years ago, and said, by the way, I talked to White House high-level people. It was only Bush that stopped him. Cheney already had him painting up the U.S. boats, like Iranian patrol boats, to actually stage an attack on our ships. Well, now, as you know, 2 days ago, the U.S. sent an aircraft carrier through the Strait of Hormuz during the Iranian drill. The Iranians have said they will try to shut down the Strait of Hormuz if the blockade against their oil supplies takes place. About 51% of their gasoline is imported. They have lots of oil, but not a lot of refineries. Israel, the U.S., and others are reportedly blowing up missile bases and assassinating people, launching Stuxnet attacks. So the war is already going on covertly. The question is, why is the former head of Mossad, who Netanyahu got fired a year ago, come out and said it would, quote, be a catastrophe 2 weeks ago to attack Iran? Why are so many other people saying it inside the Pentagon? But then separately, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff came out last week and said, we can take care of Iran easily. They just don't know it yet. I mean, is this just more saber rattling, or is it moving towards the real green light? We couldn't probably have a more informed expert on this than former CIA analyst Ray McGovern. Ray, thank you for joining us today, sir.
Most welcome, Alex.
Wow. So how close to midnight are we here?
Well, things are pretty dicey there. There's a game of chicken going on in the Persian Gulf. In the Strait of Hormuz, we have U.S. aircraft carriers and other naval vessels testing the strait amid an exercise being conducted by the Iranian Navy. Now, one doesn't have to be a student of international relations to realize what potential there is for volatility here, what potential there is for an incident, either an accident or a accidental on purpose incident, which would set Israel and Iran and perhaps the United States as well into armed conflict. This is very, very serious. When you quoted the chairman of the Joint Chiefs recently on this subject, you know, we used to have a real pro. His name was Mike Mullen. And he knew. I mean, he knew, like Admiral Fallon before him as head of CENTCOM, what it would mean. What it would mean to be getting engaged in a war with Iran. And so Mullen, at every chance, went over to Israel and told him, look, don't think that we're going to automatically spring to your aid if you start a war with Iran. As a matter of fact, he did all kinds of things. One of the things that Mullen did, when it was particularly dicey, and he needed to summon all his strength to dissuade the Israelis from going through with it, this was 2008, you know what he did? He raised the issue of the USS Liberty, that terrible, accidental, but on purpose attack it was a deliberate attack, we know from the intercepts, by the Israeli Air Force and Navy on June 8th, 1967, which killed 34 American service people and wounded 174 more. They tried to sink the USS Liberty, knowing that it was a U.S. ship. Now, that has never been mentioned in diplomatic discourse with the Israelis before, but Mullen pulled it out of his quiver and said, look, you know, I'm a naval officer. I know what happened on June the 8th, 1967. Don't even think of perpetrating an incident in the Persian Gulf or anywhere else and think I'm going to support a retaliatory strike by the United States. Now, the reason I mentioned Mullen is partly because his successor, it's really hard to describe his successor because he's sort of a non-entity. He was just in place as Army Chief of Staff for a couple of months before all of a sudden the fellow who was slated to become Joint Chief of Staff was judged to be not very malleable. He had his own, don't tell anybody, but he had his own views on things, and he would give the president independent analysis on things like Afghanistan, okay? Now, he was shunted aside, partly because Robert Gates thought he was an unreliable person. And this fellow comes in, this new chief of staff. Now, I was writing about him yesterday, and his name is Dempsey. And he made his career by being 20 years seized with the issue of Iraq, okay? He was active in Desert Storm, and then he was in Iraq during the war that we engaged in when Bush decided to attack Iraq. Now, he was interviewed. This is relevant because what I'm about to say reflects on the kind of advice that President Obama is getting. When Dempsey was interviewed, actually by a Washington Post reporter, his name is Greg Jaffe, he referred to his 20-year involvement with Iraq, and then he acknowledged that, he and the U.S. Army didn't ever quite get to understand the nature of the conflict in Iraq. And then he added this comment, one sentence. People say to me, says General Dempsey, now chair of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, people say to me, for God's sake, you were a two-star general. How could you say that you didn't understand? You were there 20 years. Dempsey, I don't know how I can say that, but I lived it, and I mean it.
Wow.
Hello. Now, this is the guy that's advising the President of the United States on what might happen in the Persian Gulf. One of the other things that Admiral Mullen did when he saw, remember that incident in January of 2008 where there were patrol boats sort of swarming and U.S. vessels in the Strait of Hormuz?
Yes.
And there was a sort of fake incident. Well, right after that, Mullen proposed, what's lacking here is any military-to-military contacts between Iran and the United States. There aren't any, of course. There aren't any contacts
Yeah,
at
let's
all.
set up a hotline, but that went over like a lead balloon.
Well, they suggested it subtly, and it never got to first base. And people say, oh, the Iranians weren't interested. I don't believe that. I don't believe that for a minute. It was Dick Cheney that wasn't interested. So Mullen, even though he raised that trial balloon, never got to first base. Well, our recommendation, we wrote an op-ed today, and our recommendation is simply this, that number one, you set up military communications to avoid mistakes, to avoid things that go bump in the night, to avoid things that can get out of hand rather quickly, whether accidentally or on purpose. Number two, what our president needs to do is make a public statement saying, look, with all due respect to Israeli leaders, if you think that we will, in a knee-jerk fashion, jump to your aid if you provoke an armed conflict with Iran, think again, because we're not going to do that. Now, that, Alex, that's all it would take. If the president committed himself publicly not to be provoked into supporting Israel in such a conflict, Israel really would have to take heed. Now, people say, oh, the president couldn't do that. Look at the Israel lobby that smother him. Well, that's not my concern. My concern is an accidental or an on-purpose incident there in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz that would lead to this kind of conflict. We have two other recommendations for the president. One is, it's exactly what we suggested to President Bush. The first issuance that Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPS, the first issuance we made as a corporate entity was on the 5th of February, 2003. And you'll remember immediately what happened that day. That was the day of Colin Powell's speech before the UN. Now, we did a 4-page memorandum for the president by 5 o'clock that afternoon. Among other things, we pointed out that our intelligence analysts, our former colleagues, were under great pressure to distort the intelligence. We gave Colin Powell an A for delivery and a C- for context and for substance. But what I'm getting at is the final sentence we raised. I have it right here. I don't have it right here, but I have it committed to memory. We said, Mr. President, we strongly urge you to widen the circle of your advisors beyond those who are hell-bent on starting a war for which we see no imperative and from which we believe the unintended consequences are likely to be catastrophic.
Well, Ray McGovern, let me stop you right there, because I've been interviewing you now for close to a decade, and so much of what you've said has come true. And it's not like you and your organization are being pretentious. You guys have advised presidents. That was your specialty, was taking all the data, all the real intel, all the real research, and then boiling it down for a world image of what was happening. Clearly, we probably would have had nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62 if the kind of leaders we have today were in charge then. I mean, so many of them have never been in the military. People like Richard Pearl brag at cocktail parties that, you know, he kills people and launches big wars. I mean, these are the classic little, almost Kim Jong-il type, toddling, wannabe dictatorial types that we're dealing with. So here's my question for you. From just watching this, it's gone from a stance of trying to get a war maneuvered with Iran to now more and more signals all over the media that it's a foregone conclusion. Strange, almost childlike comments by Dempsey. And again, I mean, it's scary that he seems addled, that they may have just put him in there because you know, he'll take the fall or whatever. But then separately, you've got all these other people, like even the Secretary of Defense, saying it's not a good idea. So it seems like there's a big split in the government publicly going on, but it looks like the Israel lobby and others in the media are going to go ahead and try to push this through, and that war could basically be imminent. Now, I mean, that's kind of a smorgasbord of ideas, but what are you hearing in D.C.?
Well, the important thing, in my view, Alex, is what Netanyahu and Ehud Barak, the defense minister over there in Israel, what impression they have of our president. That's key. The president and Leon Panetta can go over, Panetta did go over to Israel and say, please don't start a war with Iran, please, or pretty please. You know? Or it wouldn't be good. No, it would be very, very bad. The question is whether they take him seriously. They don't. When Netanyahu came here, he got more standing ovations in Congress than the president got. Netanyahu's in the catbird seat. And that's why I suggest that unless Obama makes a public pronouncement saying, look, you know, war against Iran is not what we want right now. And if you mousetrap us or try to mousetrap us into that, we're not going to do it. Unless Obama says that in a credible fashion, Netanyahu is bound to conclude, in my view, that this is the time. It's an election year. The Congress is going to be in full support. So will the pro-Zionist newspapers, and he'll have a free rein about it.
Well, I mean, Netanyahu is insiders have told the Washington Times in a positive way that he wants to be like Churchill. So they think once we're committed to a big war, everybody's going to line up behind it. So what you're saying is the president has to act like the president, but we have reports in the Washington Post, as you know, of the Israeli operative Irgun son, now the mayor of Chicago, Emanuel, bosses Obama around in front of congressional delegations and cracks his knuckles in his ear. So undoubtedly Obama's blackmailed and controlled. I mean, I know you're saying it's a good idea for him to stand up and actually serve U.S. interests, but I mean, do you see any way of having that happen when Obama pretty much is a teleprompter reading empty suit?